Training is the most important stimulus for building muscle mass, so it doesn't matter how good your nutrition setup is, if your training is not on point, you're going to be leaving gains on the table. After my gaining phase setup video, in which I discussed the changes I was making from my first gaining phase, in which I built 3 to 4 kilos of muscle over 14 months, a couple of people asked to see a video on my training setup for this gaining phase that I've just started. So that's exactly what I'm going to walk you through today. Not every exercise, not my warm-up routine, but the principles behind how I built the program and the justifications. Because most people build their training programs backwards, and what I mean by that is the first thing they'll decide is on the exercises that they're going to do. Whereas really this should be one of the last things that you do when you're programming. Considerations before that should be for volume, intensity, frequency, everything that I'm going to cover in today's video. So let's get into it. Here are the principles behind my training program for this gaining phase. The first thing I do before writing any training program, and it's something that tends to get forgotten about a lot these days, is ask the question, what is the main goal? And that might sound obvious, but I see this go wrong all the time. For example, guys who want to build muscle but then follow a strength only program without enough accessory work to build muscle. Or guys whose main goal it is to build muscle but then attend HIIT classes 3 times a week. And I'm not saying any of these are wrong and you can't build muscle doing them, but if your main goal is hypertrophy, so to build muscle, you need to ensure that you're providing a big enough stimulus in order for change to happen for you to build muscle. So now we know what my main goal is, hypertrophy. We can build the program around this to be as optimal as possible. The next thing I needed to do was decide how many days per week I can consistently train, because consistency is the foundation of any training program. You could have the best program in the world, but if you're not consistently making those sessions, then it's pointless. And I found after years of training that 4 sessions per week tends to be my sweet spot. I recover well on 4 sessions, it fits around my work, it fits around my lifestyle, and if something comes up and I have to miss a session, I can always reschedule it for later in the week. Now, there's no magic number when you're deciding how many days per week you should train. The main question is how many sessions per week can you consistently train? Because 3 sessions done consistently every week is better than 5 sessions that are inconsistent. Another important factor when deciding upon how many days per week you're going to train is also your training volume. And it's actually one of the most overlooked parts when somebody's writing a training program, and yet it's one of the most essential, especially if your main goal is hypertrophy. The research shows that between 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week is the sweet spot for most people who are trying to build muscle. But that doesn't mean that you can't grow on less or more than that. The key is to figuring out what works for you. And a principle I like to follow when I'm assigning training volume is something called the minimum effective dose, which is essentially what is the minimum amount of volume you can do per week and still grow. Right now, for my training status, I am training between 10 to 15 sets per muscle group per week. Now, this differs on different muscle groups and depending upon what I need to work on more, but pretty much everything will fall in that 10 to 15 bracket, because at the moment that is the minimum volume I can get away with and still grow. And the reason why I start at the lower end of the scale is because let's say I jump straight to 20 sets per muscle group per week now. For one, this is going to take a lot of time during the week, but 2, I'm also going to eventually plateau on this, and it doesn't give me much room after this without spending even more time in the gym. But if I start at 10 to 15, I'm making good gains on this, then eventually when I start to plateau, if I need to add a little bit more volume in, I can increase volume as a tool for progression in order for me to keep progressing. So now my training volume is in place, it's really important that for those sets to actually count towards building muscle, that I am taking these sets close enough to failure. So this is something called training intensity. So for my training intensity, I will be taking all my exercises within 3 reps to failure on each exercise. However, this will depend on the exercise itself and also the rep scheme. But if every set is close enough to failure, then these sets are going to be counting towards building muscle. And this is a part where I see a lot of guys get wrong, because they're doing the sets, they're doing the reps, but they're leaving around 5 to 6 reps, sometimes even more, on each set. And then they're wondering why they're not getting results. You need to be making sure that you are pushing all these sets and that you are close enough to failure depending upon the exercise and depending upon the rep scheme that you've set. So I've already discussed that I'm going to be training 4 days per week. But I'm also going to make sure that I'm training each muscle group at least twice per week, because you can build muscle just training each muscle group once per week. but training each muscle group twice per week does show better results for maximizing muscle growth. However, because I will be counting something called fractional sets within my training, this does mean that for some muscle groups that I could be training them 3 times, potentially even 4 times per week, but in these sessions it will be minimal volume. I've also used a variety of rep ranges within this program, so I will be taking all my exercises anywhere from 6 to 20 reps depending on the exercise and depending on the reps in reserve target. Because remember, there's no such thing as a muscle building rep range. It's about using intelligent combinations of rep ranges, sets and reps in reserve targets. So the progression model I will be using for this program is something called auto-regulated double progression. It combines a reps in reserve target with a rep range to determine when and whether I should increase the weight on a movement. What I actually like about this progression model is that it's individualized to each session and about how I'm performing on that day. So it's not just a rigid number I have to hit depending upon how my session's going, but it does require effort and you to be honest and you to have a good understanding of how to record and use reps in reserve, because it only actually works if you are taking these sets close to failure. Notice how this is the last thing that I'm now going to talk about, and that is exercise selection. And it was pretty much the last thing I decided when I wrote this training program, because exercise selection is important, but everything I've just covered is far more important. Yet when most people decide on a training program, the first thing they do is select the exercises, but exercise selection should be one of the last decisions you actually make. But for every exercise in my program, I am biasing towards a deep stretch, a controlled eccentric and a powerful concentric. Apply those 3 principles to any exercise and you'll get the most out of it for hypertrophy. The final thing I want to mention is long length partials. For some exercises, in particular calves, I will be using long length partial reps. And as I've already mentioned, for every exercise in the program, I'll be biasing towards the deep stretch portion of the lift. And even for some exercises, I will pause in that deep stretch position for a couple of seconds, because the research around lengthened positions is growing and it's showing a lot of positive outcomes for building muscle, particularly for muscles like the triceps and calves. And if you're finding this video useful, make sure you follow me on Instagram, where I post daily content on training, nutrition, building muscle, fat loss. The link to my Instagram can be found in the description below. So that's my training setup overview. My main goal is hypertrophy. I'm training 4 days per week. Volume 10 to 15 sets per muscle group per week. Intensity will be from 3 reps to failure on each set, depending on the exercise and rep range. I will be training each muscle group at least twice per week. The rep scheme will be anywhere from 6 to 20 reps on an exercise, and the rep ranges within that will vary from exercise to exercise. For the progression model I will be using, it is something called auto-regulated double progression. Exercise selection, I will be biasing towards the deep stretch portion of a lift, and we'll be lifting with a controlled eccentric and a powerful concentric. And I haven't covered every single exercise or my warm-up or anything else like that, because the video would just be too long. However, if you do have any questions on anything I've been through, or if there's anything else you would like to know about my training program, then please add it in the comments below and I'll make sure I get back to you. Finally, if you're not sure whether you should be focusing on a gaining phase, a fat loss phase, or a body recomposition, I've created a free quiz. It takes less than 60 seconds to complete, and it takes into account your current body fat percentage, training age, and a few other factors. The link for this is in the description below, and I'll also pin it to the top comment. And if you haven't already, please like this video and also subscribe as well. Thanks, and I'll see you at the next one.